Okay, I want to do a pretty simple posing video. Um, you know, I have a few different flaws that I can kind of show, like how to navigate posing a rabbit with different flaws. Unfortunately, this is kind of something that is a lot of feel, and it just takes a lot of practice. So, somebody may make it look easy, and then it's very difficult to pose the rabbit when you're at home. You're like, how did they make it look so easy? And some barns are going to have common faults that maybe I don't have here, and so I'm not going to be able to necessarily give you all the tricks for posing rabbits with different faults. But generally speaking, rabbits with long length of bodies are going to be the hardest to pose, and rabbits with not necessarily long shoulders but low shoulders. And when we talk about low shoulders, because if we're looking at the top line of a rabbit this way, when we talk about long shoulders, they're long going up the top line, right? And you can have a dip in the shoulder, which I do have in a couple, and a dip is going to be whenever it is like abrupt to where the shoulder stops and then the rise starts. It's going to have like this kind of effect, right? And dips are, when you talk about shoulder problems, having low shoulders and dipped shoulders, beyond anything else, are the most difficult to pose. I have plenty of long shouldered rabbits that aren't that hard to pose, but it's because they don't have a dip. And that dip is like when you go to compact the rabbit and your rabbit has a dip in its shoulder, essentially you're just like jabbing the shoulder against the rise, which is super uncomfortable for them, which is why they freak out, because they're uncomfortable. And so that's why the dips are some of the hardest to pose, because they won't truly compact. And sometimes when maybe you have a good length of body, but like that shoulder is preventing you from compacting the rabbit, so it makes like judging the length of body hard, because like you have to imagine, well, if that shoulder weren't there, if I had a better shoulder, what's the length of body less the shoulder? And sometimes that's where people get things confused, where it's like, is the shoulder long or is the length of body long? And then low shoulders, when we talk about having a deep shoulder or a low shoulder, we're talking about this way, right? So like length is lateral, and the dip is something that you can see from the side. And then deep shoulders are the actual distance from the ground. And this is usually something that not many people pay attention to, the depth of shoulder. It's more common to have the topic in like Californians, for example, because the Californian breed of rabbit has notoriously deep shoulders, which is actually not necessarily a hugely positive thing, because it makes a really tall shoulder, actually makes it harder to compact the rabbit, because you tend to want to grab their head and put their nose towards the table, and you can't do that when they have a super deep shoulder, because naturally their head sits higher off the table, right? But you don't want a super low shoulder, and so low shoulders are whenever they're like this close to the ground, or the table, and you don't necessarily want to have a really low shoulder, because it kind of does the same thing that a dip will do. Having a really low shoulder can tend to affect their compactability. And so I have a couple variations that I'll try to pull out. There are a few techniques. Not every rabbit is going to be able to settle into position. That's just a fact. Sometimes the best pose you're going to get out of a rabbit, the feet aren't going to be touching. And so the feet don't have to touch. In fact, I have plenty of longer bodied rabbits that I've gotten out of a few recent pairings where, maybe they're like, I've got one with like really good height, and his shoulder is actually not that bad in length, but he just has an overall longer length of body. And so when I try to get his feet to compact together, he just doesn't want anything to do with it. And if I can get him to settle into a nice position, even if his feet are a little separated, if that's where he's comfortable at, then great. The main thing though, when you have a rabbit that has their feet still separated because they have a longer length of body, is you still want the back feet to be in line with the hip. So rabbits can be longer bodied, but they're not properly posed unless the weight of the rabbit is sitting shifted back onto their hindquarter. And so if the rabbit is still elongated, right, like, oh yeah, well maybe they're just long and I can't really compact them that well, and so I'm just gonna plop them on the table and kind of give them a little push, and yeah, it's close enough, but you're gonna be able to see that the back of the rabbit, when we're looking at the top line, you want the back hindquarter to be like as vertical as possible. If it goes like this, you're overposing them. 90 degrees is proper, and then going like this, where it's at a slant, you haven't properly gotten the weight of the rabbit to be shifted on top of the hips. And so the feet placement can be separated as long as that hip is still 90 degrees. And so that's generally the rule that we look for. I'm not a massive stickler about the front feet as much. I mean, if the rabbit wants to do a little elbow here and they want to like punch forward a little bit and their feet aren't like elbows down, I mean, it's fine. Sometimes the longer shouldered rabbits, you kind of have to do this technique where you like plaster their front end down flat in order to try to see what their hindquarter looks like. But I'm not a stickler with the front feet either way, as long as they're not like in front of them. I don't care how much in front of the eyes or behind them. It doesn't affect the rabbit's pose nearly. Like, it's important if you want to get a perfect pose, and if you're going to post a picture online, then people are going to go, oh, your front feet are supposed to be in line under their eyes and the elbows are supposed to be on the ground. But like, really though, I'm mostly going to complain about people not having the hindquarter aligned, because that will dramatically affect your top line way more than having your front feet out of line. So that's where my focus is. And if you've seen me and my posing videos, there's not commentary like I'm going to try to do today, but I kind of hold their head in position and I fiddle with the back feet constantly, right? There are some judges that they say, you push the head back, and there are some judges that are like, oh, don't do that. You hold their head still and then you compact their butt forward. Sometimes I do a combination of both, but it's mostly to adjust the hindquarter. If I'm doing this directional thing, it's not because I'm compacting the rabbit this way. I never compact from the head back. When I mess with a rabbit from the head, it's because the rabbit I can feel the rabbit leaning forward, and I'm trying to shift its weight onto that back hindquarter. So a lot of what I do is focused on that back hindquarter, and I think really that's the biggest piece of advice I can get, is focus on the hindquarter. Especially whenever I'm trying to evaluate a rabbit in a picture, if you ask me to look at one, I mean, it severely distorts, trying to see how tall the hip structure is, it severely distorts it whenever the rabbit is trying to do something weird with its butt or if it's twisting. And sometimes rabbits can have decent bodies and still just be a pain in the butt. And my bucks tend to be a pain in the butt. We have rambunctious bucks and really sweet does. We have usually the opposite. So, okay, I'm gonna grab a couple. Okay, example of a rambunctious buck with a fair body type. He is very hard to pose just because he's a pain in the butt. He's also in the teenage age. He looks gigantic. He is gigantic. I swear to God, he's only 4 months old. He's probably over 8 pounds. Easily over 8 pounds. So he's just a monster. And he's extremely firm bodied. He's very muscular, which tend to be a little bit firmer to pose. If you have a floppy body rabbit, you can kind of squish them a little better, but really muscular bodies can be harder. See, look, he's already he's jumpy, right? Okay. Generally get the feet in the right place. Hold the head. What I'm doing is I'm taking my back fingers. See, he's already going to be a pain. I'm taking my back fingers and I'm grabbing their foot, right? I'm grabbing in their ankle, and while keeping their head calm and still, I'm hooking that back ankle and pulling it back as far as possible, because if I were to just not adjust the back feet and then try to tuck him with this type of motion, he's just going to become overposed, and they tend to be fussier because most rabbits don't have the spine flexibility to do a little 360 here, right? So I want to get his back feet as far back as humanly possible before I even do any compacting. I'm going to align his back feet by hooking it, making sure the toes are tucked in, and he requires some manhandling, so bear with me. But after you've tucked the back feet, okay, back feet aligned, right? So now I can tell that he's not resting on his back heels, right? He was like doing this weird thing. Did not pick a very good first rabbit. You know, but this is like the reality, right? Like, not every rabbit is easy to pose. Okay. When I can feel them settle into their shoulders, right? So like, I don't feel this, I don't feel like this or this, right? Like when I can feel him settle into his shoulders, sometimes I will like wrap my fingers around their jawbone. Some rabbits hate this, but I think if I can feel them settle into their shoulders, that's usually not too uncomfortable for them. Some people pose with a flat palm on their face, that's fine, if the rabbit is chill, but like pain in the butt rabbits like him, I mean, you really gotta hold on to him. You really gotta manhandle them to tell him who's boss. And, you know, I'm not gonna spend an hour screwing around with him because he's just gonna get more pissed off. I mean, even well-behaved rabbits that stay still for you are eventually gonna get sick and tired of you, right? And so I'm gonna manhandle him by like fingers around the jaw, trying to get him to settle into his shoulders. And it's nose to the ground. I don't want to crank his head forward, right? Like he didn't like that. I'm not cranking his face forward to get his nose into the ground, but it's not a flat press. Like I don't want to do this to him. I don't want to like pancake his shoulder, right? I want him to sort of settle and almost hunch into the shoulder. And so there are many judges who refuse to screw around with fussy rabbits like this, and you can do the pancake if he is being an absolute ass and I cannot get him to sit still. The pancake will guarantee, if you have a long shoulder, just pancake the long shoulder, and almost like you're posing a Flemish or a Velveteen or like any sort of long breed. You know, you sort of like, you hold the shoulder in place and you fix the hindquarter, and a lot of times when you have a long shoulder, they sort of look like that mandolin shape, which they're not supposed to, but it happens, we get long shoulders. And so you sort of use like that Flemish technique of pancaking the shoulder so that you can see what the hindquarter is doing, and then you just have to imagine that the shoulder is shorter, right? Come here. And so I'm gonna manhandle him because he doesn't have a long shoulder, but you could do like the pancake over the long shoulder and then tuck the booty, or some people will do like what I call a guillotine. That is not a coined term that people use. That's one of my other things that I just made up. But you could do a guillotine where essentially you pinch their head at their neck. So between the head and the shoulder, you can kind of pinch them at their neck. I don't like doing that. I think my sister does that sometimes when they're fussy. It doesn't really work out great for me. I prefer like either getting the tuck with my fingers, or just the pancake whenever I'm just gonna be quick and I just need to look at one quick thing. So we're gonna fix the front feet. I'm gonna try to get him to settle nose to the ground without cranking his head forward. We're still kind of at like a 45-degree angle here. His head's not like flat and it's not like out like this. You know, you don't want to hide the rise with their ears, but you also, you know, you don't want to crank their head forward, because that's where you get a lot of the pullback like this, where people are, you know, you'll be able to like, oh, they have such a long, low shoulder, but it's because the rabbit's doing this because you're trying to crank its head forward like this, and it's trying to pull back on you. You know, and I think that 45 degrees with nose to the ground, see, he's comfortable like that. I could screw around with his head like that and he didn't care. And you sort of want to almost put the pressure towards their back elbows. That's sort of the only angle that I can really describe it as. Because a lot of this is feel. You have to like feel that the rabbit is comfortable. So trying to put it into words, it's slight down, 45-degree angle, and a slight, not straight back and not straight down. It's a towards the elbow, like diagonal push. And you don't want to push too much, and the longer the shoulder and the worse problems you have with the shoulder, the less head motion you're going to be able to make. So you just have to find what's comfortable for their shoulder, however they'll settle, and then screw around with the hindquarter. And he's pulling back, right? So we don't want him to pull back. So a lot of times for a rabbit that's pulling back, that's when you use the pincher technique, because if I can get him, it's gonna be fussy. And he doesn't have a great body. right? Okay, I'm aligning his feet. God, you're rolly. Okay, head in position, and I'm using a pincher to try to push his weight forward, fixing the back hindquarter. And as I feel him pull like that, I'm trying to like push less. If I feel him resisting, I push less. And some of them require a stop and a gentle hand, and some of them just, you gotta squish him, you know, like Washington, I just gotta manhandle him. And then the more I manhandle him, the easier he is. And this buck, I kind of have to like feel, right? Okay, I'm kind of, I naturally transitioned into this guillotine because I kind of felt him screwing around. Okay, I'm holding his head in like a guillotine stance, not quite pancaking, but in a guillotine to get him to stop screwing around. And then I can kind of transition into a more regular stance. Okay, that's all I'm gonna get out of this buck. He's fussy. Another fussy one. Okay, this is a doe that has barely been handled. I just got my hands on her for the first time. She's about 9 or 10 weeks old, and I only got her yesterday from somebody. It was a co-breeding, and so I got my pick, and so she has not been handled. So this is hardly a handled doe. So if you don't handle yours until 8, 9, 10 weeks old, this is the rabbit for you, because she does not know how to be handled. She has a nice body, but not phenomenal, so we have to kind of work with it. Okay. Fixing the hindquarter. I'm hooking my fingers around the back, keeping their butt still so that I'm not pulling the rabbit out like that. I'm using my forearm to support the hindquarter. Forearm to support the hindquarter while I pull the back foot back as far as possible. Okay. Get her feet situated. Sometimes if they want to splail their feet out, you can like kind of grab with your pinky and your thumb, and you can kind of keep the toes tucked in. This tends to help them from twisting, because when a rabbit wants to twist, they'll stick one foot out and push with opposite force. And so sometimes when they want to twist, you can kind of use your pinky and your thumb when you're grabbing their head as a guide to keep their toes in, because that makes them twist less, right? Okay, keeping toes in, fixing back hindquarters, feeling her try to settle into her shoulder. Shush, shush. Okay, a little bit of length in the shoulder, so she's not gonna be super, super easy to pose. I can try to find one with a short shoulder. Fix hindquarter. Okay. I could probably get her to compact with her elbows completely touching her back feet, because she does have a decent amount of flexibility, but generally she's a little bit longer. I can feel her resisting, pulling back. I can feel her resisting, and so I'm not gonna force it, you know, because I can kind of tell that she has a longer length of body. Okay, when I can totally get their nose to the ground, that's when they've essentially settled, right? Because otherwise they're going to try to be doing anything they can to get out of your hand. When you can get the nose to the ground, that's when they've settled. All rabbits can stay in a pose without assistance if you get them into the tightest possible position while still being comfortable, right? Like even her, long-bodied, not super tall, little bit of length in the shoulder, and I got her to settle, get the head into the right position where the shoulders are tightened with the neck properly to where she's not like stressed or pushing or tense in her shoulder. And then also being decently rested back on her hindquarter enough. And she's not like a super deep, peaky doe, so she kind of still curved like this, but that's just her top line. And she wasn't like pushing forward or leaning back. Her weight was like centered nicely, and everything was like nicely settled into position. And so there are some rabbits that they pop up the moment that I let go of them. Even if I get them into a good settled position, they'll just pop up. But maybe if I worked with them longer to get them to calm down, maybe they would stay into a nice unassisted pose. Probably, but I don't have patience for that. Sometimes you just need to get a good enough pose to be able to look at a rabbit, and the better you get at evaluating, the easier it is that you can just go, squish, oh yeah, and I see everything. And you don't have to get them into a perfect pose to evaluate a rabbit, but they're, you know, like having them like severely undertucked, or they're like pulling or pushing on their shoulders distorts their top line. And so as long as you know that everything is like centered and balanced in the way that their weight is, and they're not like tense anywhere, then I don't have to get like a perfect feet placed, centered, calm pose to evaluate. Sometimes you can get quick at it. Okay, let's grab another one. And like I'm not grabbing like beautiful rabbits to make this look easy. I'm like semi-intentionally grabbing ones with less good body type so that you get the sense of how to pose any rabbit, because yeah, sure, it would be easy if everybody posed nicely, but you know, the ones with issues tend to not be. Okay, so this one is 6 and ooh, your fur feels pretty good coming in. Like 6.5 weeks old, although quite big for a 6.5 week old baby. So this is like the young version of the video. Super easy for the most part to pose young babies because I can manhandle them, right? I can't do that to this buck quite as easily, and he's gonna throw a fit. You know, he's in that teenage stage, and he'll get easier too. And sometimes they go through growth spurts, and he kind of seems like he's going through a little bit of a growth spurt because he was a little lanky. You know, but babies are going to be easier to pose, but because they're so squishy when they're younger, they're harder to evaluate. But nonetheless, okay, get front legs generally in the right place, get them to accept the hand being on the head, fixing the hind quarter, right? I do the wiggle sometimes to get them to settle back like this, right? Like to get them to settle back. Okay, I'm doing a jawbone pinch. This is so much easier on babies. I tend to like doing the jawbone grab on a baby, especially just because even if they're gonna have a long shoulder eventually, they always appear to be shorter when they're younger, and then they go outward. So it's easier on a short-shouldered rabbit to do that jawbone pinch. So, okay, front feet. Okay, do you see that? Sometimes I do things and I don't even realize it. Okay, I was getting her settled up, and in order to get her to shift her weight up more upward, to get her ready to tuck, because if I tried to just tuck like this, like that's fine. You know, she looks okay. But if I had her, you know, I don't want to like stretch her out, right? I want her to feel like we're going to get ready to hunch forward. So when I place them down, I try to like naturally get them to be in a slight hunched position. I don't want to stretch them out. And so whenever I put the feet down, do not pull the rabbit forward to get the feet and the elbows down. What you should be doing is in a slight hunch position, get the toes, just the front toes, get the toes near the head. And the gauge it for me is like when I put my hand on their head, the toes should be within fingers reach. I mean, I have little short fingers, but, you know, rough, okay? The toes should be roughly to where if I needed to keep their toes in with my trick, right, with the pinky and the thumb, they should be within reach. If they're too far forward and they're under my hand, that's not good. If they're too far back and I can't reach them, that's not right. So a good gauge is for putting their toes within reach of your hand when you grab their head, and then get the elbows down by positioning their head. So what people tend to do is they try to get the front legs, elbows down. See, like I'm grabbing her and it's like, oh, these are her elbows, right? And I'm like, I want the elbows to be on the ground. But then you end up elongating the rabbit, and then they don't want to like get into this tight pose. And so what you do is slight hunch without moving laterally. She's being so good. I'm gonna jinx it. Without moving her laterally, in that slight hunch, get the feet and the toes in the right place, and then using the head position, that's when you push the elbows down, right? So when I talked about getting down onto the elbows as the right angle, okay, elbows are up, elbows are down, right? Toes in the right position, head up and back towards the elbows, and that will get their elbows to touch the ground. Easier on a short-shouldered rabbit like her, but toes aligned, 45 degrees back to get the elbows down without elongating the rabbit. She's in a slight, I mean, this is not a natural pose, because notice that she's doing this thing, right? So her hind quarter is not in line where it's doing this. So I want to shorten her up to where her hind quarter is more seated, right? So this is under posed. And so toes, elbows back, holding steady in position, however you want to do it based on how the rabbit's reacting. Okay? Pinch to get them to tighten forward. And after this, they do tend to like move their elbows around, so sometimes you got to readjust the front multiple times. Feet, tuck, tuck, tuck. Okay? At this point, the hind quarter is at least straight up and down, right? So she peaks early, slides off just a touch, but I can see that generally this is proper. She actually is elbows down. And so they don't have to have a perfect top line to get into a good pose. Okay, so people will mess with the front feet and they go, okay, I'm holding the rabbit and I'm just gonna like hold its head here, and then they go, like this, and you see how, okay, she has a good body. I just posed her nicely, and you see how when I just tried to gently touch their head and I try to just push her feet, she tends to go like this, right? And that's not what you want. That would be overposed. This is overposed. She's fussy. This is a good shouldered rabbit. She has a decently short length of body. She is not a difficult to pose rabbit by any means. So she should not be fighting me. And if they have a good body and they're fighting you, you're doing something wrong in your technique, right? I'm trying to think of all the different ways that people screw things up, because it's like driving a car. It's like natural for me. So I try to think of other ways, right? So like you're not just like gently holding the head. You want to tuck it into the shoulders, comfortable, firm, and then you don't just like push the feet. Like at no point am I ever like tucking her feet. Like when I compact a rabbit, I am pinching with the pinchers. Now she's gonna be fussy. Okay, I am like pinching to hunch forward and then smoothing out to make sure that the feet, like I should be able to sort of feel that the heels like are aligned with her back. When I go like that, I should be able to feel that her feet aren't out or under in any direction. And I'm really compacting using that pincher where they sort of do that little, they shudder forward. Okay, now she's gonna be upset, but, okay. Sister, toes forward. Okay, similar thing, right? This doe has a longer, narrower shoulder. Notice how she's not any less fussy for me to pose. Okay, this is to get them to compact, not squish. Don't squish, 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 squish like this. Settle the shoulders, hunch forward, make sure that the back is aligned. Okay. Bigger rabbit. Oh, and she's grumpy too. She wants to be bred. Okay, feet together. She has a long shoulder. She has a dip in her shoulder, okay? Getting her comfortable in the front end. Back feet straight. Slowly going to compact. Okay, that's all she will compact. Her feet are not touching, not on this side at least. Her feet aren't really touching. They're still a little bit gapped, but you see there's a dip. I'm never gonna get her to really compact more than that because I'm fighting this dip and this length in the shoulder here, right? Early peak, a little bit of a flat spot. Well, tall hind quarter and straight up and down pretty much with where her weight is resting. I could try to get her to like maybe seat back just a touch more, but I don't want her to get fussy at me, and so this is what's comfortable, and she stays still, okay? And sometimes you can get them to like compact a little more on their shoulders with the jawbone, but you really have to like feel if the rabbit is fighting you, and you have to find that sweet spot. There is a sweet spot where their head will get into their shoulders pretty deeply, but you gotta find the sweet spot and you can't force it, and some days they just don't wanna cooperate. Thankfully, she's a pretty easy poser. Even though she has her body flash, she's a pretty easy poser. So I can really get her into that nice tight sweet spot despite her shoulder. Okay, but notice, A little bit longer length of body, still good height, balanced overall, but long shoulder and dip, I mean, she's got her problems, right? Still not horrible to pose, but it's because I'm feeling her and I'm feeling what's comfortable. Can I get her into a tight pose? Yes, sometimes I'll pose them super tight like this, and then I'll take a picture, you know? Well, she's staying actually pretty good, it wasn't overposed. But you can like super tight pose a rabbit and take a picture, and you can distort their top line a little bit. But that's not gonna do you any good for when you're evaluating. Ooh, exciting. Okay, come here. This is my first generation sable doe out of 2 parents that I did not breed. Mom is notoriously long-bodied. I mean, she's super long-bodied and super flat. And this doe is very much looks just like mom, so you can imagine what mom looks like because this is identical. Good example of a different body type that is not typically ours, that is a work in progress. Okay, toes aligned. She's kind of weirdly angled. I'm gonna kind of fix her. Okay, settling her head in. I can feel her relaxing, so I can settle in. She's also wanting to twist on me, so what I'm doing is I'm kind of accordioning her, trying to fight her trying to twist on me. Okay, that's all she's gonna compact. That's it. I can't squish her any more than that. Little length in the shoulder, just really flat. She's like rigid, but she's like rigid from, because her peak is like all the way forward here. And she is like rigid from here all the way up to her peak, which is basically her whole body, because her peak is like right behind her shoulder. And so like she has a longer length of body, but like if she had a better shaped hindquarter where her peak, like she's nicely rigid, but if her peak were here, she'd probably compact a little bit better because her shoulder is really not that long, right? And so it's like, yeah, she has a long length of body, but it's the rigidity from here to the peak that's like not allowing me, like, you know, if you watch one of the videos of my rabbits with depth, when I go like this, trying to settle their peak backward, you see like the whole rigid section move back as a one piece, and then I can like slide it back. Like with her, when I do the same thing, you can just see like the rigid section, it doesn't move. So when the rigid section is like deep, it moves together. When the rigid section is like crazy early peaked and long and flat, which a lot of sables tend to be, actually this is what a lot of Rex look like, to be honest. You know, like when the peak is this far forward and they're like rigid from here to here, I can't really compact them more than that. I can't fake this peak, right? I can't fake it because I can't get her to settle back without her being underposed, right? That's just what it is. And there's no sense in trying to make her look better than she is. I think the thing that people don't realize is that a lot of it has to do with like their head positioning, because the way that you grab their head and the way that you're wrenching on their head, it tends to make them like move in this way or the other, and you can kind of like guide the rabbit. Like if they're twisting, you can kind of twist their head the opposite way and they'll like turn the other way on their spine. And so holding their head is actually quite important, and I think too many people like light hand the grab. They don't grab them firm enough, or they're like pushing at the wrong angle, or they're, you know, they're not feeling that sweet spot. And when you feel it, you know, you're like, oh yeah, that feels good, and they compact well, and you're like, oh, that's a good one. You know, you really do feel when they settle into position. It should not be a forced thing. You know, sometimes you have to like force them to get them to chill, and then once they chill, they're fine. But, you know, once they're chill, you can feel them settle into position. And sometimes when I'm like evaluating babies, like those are the days where I'm just not able to get them into a position, and those are the days where maybe they're fine and they would have looked normal, but like I can't get them to look good, and they're just not wanting to, like, they don't fit into that little nice sweet spot, you know. And so it's like head position is like hugely important in order to get them to like tense their weight forward or backward. And people try to like tuck with a flat palm. You can't tuck with a flat palm. That's whenever you get those back feet kicked underneath. You know, if you do the pincher move, right, like pincher, sometimes it's a poke, sometimes it's a little bit of a slide down. They will like shudder forward, and then you can just wiggle them, right? Like I do a shudder, and then a little wiggle squeeze. It's not like a compacting, because you tend to like push their feet, and overpose them when you try to just push their heels, but like when you do the little pincher shudder and then a little like head wiggle squeeze to like get them into position. Like the wiggling is like me trying to find the sweet spot. And when they do that shudder and then you wiggle their head into the sweet spot, then they will naturally rest back. So it's not as much of a tuck, right? We don't tuck. And if you ever, and I always check the back feet. When I'm like, okay, yeah, that feels pretty good, you feel like you're settling, I always check the back feet. Because even if the rabbit seems like it's settled pretty good, having those back feet aligned will change their top line of their hip structure a little bit. So I always check the back feet, like 1,000 times I check the back feet. Well, hopefully that was helpful. I don't have a ton of rabbits to show necessarily. I mean, yes, I have a lot of rabbits, but not necessarily ones with like different attributes. So hopefully the commentary was helpful. That is way easier than me trying to write a mile-long paragraph for you guys. And sometimes it does take practice to like develop the muscle memory to posing the rabbit and like feeling that sweet spot. But you should be able to feel them settle into position, and that's something that I'm not going to be able to teach you, is feeling when they're comfortable. And every rabbit is going to be different, and some days they're just pains in the butt. But, you know, hopefully the little tricks for what to look for and how to get to that sweet spot sort of helped.